Century 14 for a shooting at Century Theaters. They're saying somebody's shooting in the auditorium.
Roger, keep your fires west of the smoke. You're cleared hot. An officer hit. Send me the world.
Don't go over that fence. Don't go over that fence. Grab the shotgun again.
Welcome to Tactical Tangents.
Welcome back to Tactical Tangents. This is Mike. This episode is brought to you by Mantis. Mantis is a firearms training tool that tracks the movement in your gun so you can step up your performance with good data and feedback. Not only does it help you stay accountable and make training more enjoyable and cost-effective, it also works in dry fire so you can train at home. I swear by dry fire training, and I use the Mantis every single time. If your shooting will have real-life consequences, use the Mantis and take your training to the next level. Get one and join our training group in the Mantis app. You can find them at mantisx.com.
And this is Jim. This episode is also brought to you by Ride-On Optics. Ride-On is a scope manufacturer, and they specialize in high-quality optics at competitive prices. They're all about customer service, and they're doing great work supporting the law enforcement and veteran communities, so we hope you check them out. Find them on Ride-On Optics. That's RITON optics.com.
Our guest today is Mr. Fernando Montes, who is an exercise physiologist working with the Los Angeles County Fire Department. And he is here today to talk about, among other things, hydration, strength and conditioning, supplementation, and his experiences working with tactical and world-class athletes. Mr. Montes has worked with Major League Baseball as the director of conditioning for the Texas Rangers and the head strength and conditioning coach for the Cleveland Indians. He was also the strength and conditioning coach for a variety of sports at Stanford University and helped implement the Thor 3 physical training program for the 10th Special Forces Group. I'm sure we're just scratching the surface on many of the cool things that Mr. Montes has done related to sports physiology and human performance, but we'll be sure to explore that as we go. Welcome to the show, sir. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Right on.
Looking forward to chat tonight.
Awesome.
So this is part of a recurring theme, kind of a series that we're doing on sports physiology and physical conditioning for operators, right? For military, law enforcement, and civilian concealed carriers to take better care of their bodies over the longer term so that they are physically and mentally prepared for, that worst day of their lives, whatever that day is, right? And
Right.
We've discussed nutrition and dieting and diet in general. We've discussed basics of working out, how to get your fat butt into the gym and start working on the stuff. We've brought physical trainers and therapists on. And so hopefully through all of this, you're going to see some recurring themes. One is you got to keep working out. You got to do it thoughtfully, and you got to get help when you need it. I think those are some kind of basic themes. And we're grateful to have you, sir. Is there anything big picture that we should know about, like kind of your messages in general?
I think it's one thing in the message platform. There's two things that are real important to me. One is you have a personal philosophy. That's your philosophy of life. That's your rock, and usually that's a very tight knit scenario. Then you have your professional philosophy, and in my view and experience after 4 decades, it should be in constant flux because you're constantly looking to become better at your skill set, being more of a professional. And whether it's watching somebody clean a weight room and they do it better because they have a technique, or a mental side from another sport or profession, it just continues to grow your capabilities to transfer that into your training program. So I think those are the two critical components that are dear to me and have been dear to me throughout my career.
Very cool. One of the things that really stood out when I was going through your background and bio as we were doing our research was your work with wildland firefighters. And can you speak real quick to just how you came to work with firefighters?
Well, I had left the Thor 3 program up at Colorado Springs. I really got tired of the contract side, working with the government, and it was a tough decision. And so while I was unemployed, I was sending in resumes and stuff like that, trying to figure out my next move. And I literally totally forgot about the LA County fire position that I applied for, their physiology position. And about 6 months to a year, I get a phone call and I'm literally on the East Coast, and they wanted to know if I was interested in interviewing for this job, and said yes, and ironically, I flew over and did the first interview, and then went back, and 2 weeks later, I came back to do a second interview and felt very comfortable. And shortly thereafter, my return, I was offered the position. Now, it's an interesting phenomenon of how things take place and how people you meet along your career path. I got the phone call, and we were going through the hiring package and so on. And one of the things I asked them, I said, "What's the reload package?" And there was a sudden sigh of silence, and they go, "Well, we don't do a reload package." So I said, "Whoa." I go, "Well, I'm very interested in the job, but I think I need to sit down and have a conversation with my wife, and we'll make some decisions." So he said, "Okay, no problem. I'll expect your call, next couple of days." And literally in less than 10 minutes, I get a phone call from a friend of mine who I did some DoD contracting with. He says, "Hey, what are you doing?" And I kind of gave him a little background of the job that I was just offered. And he goes, "Well, when do you start?" I go, "Well, I haven't really taken the position." He goes, "Well, can you start in March?" I go, "Yeah, why?" He says, "I got a gig with Special Activities 1 at NSW down in Coronado, and they're doing a collex to finish up the year, and I need you in there to do some of the human performance stuff." First question was, "How much does it pay?" The next thing you know, I had enough to make my reload. So I called the county back the next day, says, "I'm coming, but I can only be there on set date." And the rest is history.
Nice.
But that's how I ended up with the county, doing that. And then
Very cool.
Shortly thereafter, again, it was a situation of opportunities. At that time, Chief Inman was our wildland chief, and he had a son that was in college playing baseball, and found out that I had worked in Major League Baseball, and one day calls me over and says, "Hey, why don't you come over to the camp and have lunch, and I'd love to talk a little baseball and stuff." And through that conversation, it kind of morphed into, "Hey, we're having some issues in our academy. Would you be interested in coming out and checking out what we do and kind of give us some insight?" So that really launched my insight to our wildland program. It's one of the largest wildland groups in the country as far as within a fire department by itself. When we talk wildland with LA County Fire, we have 114 what we call fire suppression aides, which operate out of 4 camps, or we call paid camps, and then we have another 5 inmate camps. We have a unit that's heavy equipment or dozers, and then we have an Air Force. We have 5 Hawks, Fire Hawks, and we have 5 Bell 412s, and so we have a very large footprint in our wildland. So if you're familiar with wildland, I mean, it's billy goat work. It's the neck downers. You're paid to do neck down work.
So about that, this is a group we don't talk enough about on the show, and we really should talk more about wildland firefighting. First off, my hat is off to the wildland fire crews. As a kid from Southern California, and Mike's also a kid from Southern California, I don't know how many times my house or my friends and family's houses were saved by wildland crews, and specifically LA County wildland crews. But it's a lot. So shout out to the firefighters who listen to us, despite the fact we have a lot of cop on this show. And we're talking about this incredibly, you mentioned billy goat work, this incredibly physically intense, hot, sweaty job. It involves hiking and rucking and digging and chopping and heavy equipment operator. That's intense. Everything about that is intense, and it is literally physically hot. Fires happen on hot days, and then it turns out fire is hot.
Science.
So there's a lot going on there. So can you tell us just about the physiology that goes into working a fire line?
Well, one of the things, when you get called out, we basically start off with, we send out 2 crews on any first alarm brush. So that one crew could be a ground-based or a vehicle-based crew. Then we have the really fortunate to have the aircraft that are associated with our wildland program. We usually put 2 air crews into the mix. So we'll have basically an air attack system. So we'll put a whole hand crew in by air, and then immediately start working a fire and having that aviation to just put them on the ground, start to support them. As follow-on crews show up, they'll pull that first responding crew, that platform crew, off and put them back on their perch, waiting for the next fire to launch again. So it's a quick attack kind of methodology. With that said, that requires a different mindset, a different physical capability versus the crew that shows up on their crew bus and gets out and literally hikes into start working the fire line. So you have to look at it from the physiological standpoint of you have a fast, high intense group of individuals working, and then they get pulled out for recovery. Whereas the follow-on crews might be there the entire night and into the next day. So again, it's a different type of mentality. Physiologically, there's demands. So from a training standpoint, even though we have set standards, we also have to take into consideration that airborne platform crew needs to work almost in the old HIT environment. High intensity, back off, recover, hit it again, back off, recover. And so that's the format that we talk about within our own organization when it comes to that.
I want to come back to the HIT training thing down the road a little bit, but I guess bigger picture between the wildland firefighting thing you mentioned, and I can picture this because even in law enforcement, a lot of the activities that I might have to do, I suddenly find myself in a foot pursuit or something like that. There's not much of a warm up. There's not much of a, it's very kind of abrupt, like starting and stopping and that sort of thing. But between the wildland firefighting groups that you've worked with, professional sports, the tactical communities that you've worked around, is there one thing that you think, or some aspect of fitness that you think that one of those groups has figured out really well that everyone else can benefit from?
If I was going to break it down and I look at it from a holistic standpoint, I think the mental aspect of it, because in all the different disciplines, the mental is the biggest component. And without that, you can really negate any of your physiological benefits. If you talk about the soft community and the SF guys, that was always a major component. You watch them work and you watch them grind as a ODA together, and you see the mentals check in quite a bit. And when you're dealing with a civilian environment, you're teaching them that. Whereas the military, you're getting that early in your training, especially when you go through the soft pipelines. They're designed to weed the weak out, but the mentally strong. And, if we even go farther into the tier ones, it's not always the best guy. It's the right guy. And so when we get back to fire and you get into cities and counties and states and federal agencies, you're actually training them and teaching them those mental components, because they're really not aware of it unless you get somebody who's a veteran and has gone through some of these schools. So that's a component there where we actually start teaching that early on and when they go through their academy.
I think that's a really interesting point. We've had some discussions online about this lately about the difference between selection and training. And there are certain traits, particularly the mental aspect, that you gotta bring it to the table. There's only so much I can teach you. Like, if you don't have it, you don't have it. But of the people I do select, I owe them training, right? And I gotta get them there, both physically and mentally. One thing about training and conditioning, you work in this really interesting seam between professional athletics and tactical physical conditioning. We're all about that. It's very interesting, right? And we talked quite a bit about this here on the podcast, that there's this big push to train tactical operators, SWAT guys, SEALs, PJs, ODAs, even pilots, like elite athletes. And the term like elite athletes comes up a lot. I think that idea has a lot of merit, but I always want to explore which areas we should pull from pro athletics and which ones we shouldn't. Right. So I think one of the aspects of training like elite athletes that I get hung up on is specialization. Like, a pro football player is an elite athlete an Olympic marathon runner is an elite athlete, a UFC fighter is an elite athlete, but they each have different nutrition and conditioning regimens. And like any fashion, I'm really worried that in the telephone game, they're going to have my fat ass out there like pushing a tackling sled to make me a better pilot. And what I really need to work on is like landings. So I was hoping you could kind of speak to that and like what pieces from elite athlete we can and should apply to the tactical world and which ones we maybe shouldn't, or how we specialize, into tactical tasks from overall physical conditioning.
Well, I think overall, it's a very valid point, very key point. I think first and foremost, we have to be cautious that I know the term, the occupational athlete, the tactical athlete, and so on has been thrown around by a lot of organizations and individuals. But the reality is you're not dealing with athletes. You're dealing with a warrior, a law enforcement, a firefighter who is probably the worst athlete you've ever seen in your life. But what we're employing is athletic training methodology. And I think one of the challenges from a professional standpoint is the profession kind of lost its way. When early in your career, you got assigned to a sport, let's say it's volleyball, and you've never had any dealings with volleyball. Well, the first thing you do, you start doing an analysis of the requirements. You look at their strength requirements, you look at their recovery, you look at the energy, you look at their strength, you look at all the things that are critical to that sport as you do your analysis, and then you come up with your program. Fast forward into the tactical world, I think we have pushed that whole concept into that system without doing a total evaluation of needs in reference to the population you're working with. And the case in point, when I worked at 10th Group, every battalion has a number of ODAs, and each ODA has a specialty. And you have to be cognizant of that specialty. Therefore, when you do your analysis, that is the driving force. Besides looking at the needs of the individual, what is it they have to do to earn their money? How to stay alive?
I'm going to interrupt you real quick just to make sure our audience is tracking, because this is going to come up throughout this episode, is when he says 10th Special Forces Group, that is guys who wear green berets and train other people to fight on our behalf, right? Foreign internal defense, guerrilla warfare. They are Army Special Operations, but they are one subset of Army Special Operations. They divide up into 12-man teams that we refer to as ODAs. If you ever heard of the term an A team, that's what he's talking about, an ODA, Operational Detachment Alpha. So just want to make sure our audience is tracking what we're talking about. And their physical load is crazy, right? It involves very heavy rucking. They're skiing, among other things, and I think we're about to get into this as far as their specialties. You got guys who have to scuba, guys who have to parachute, guys who have to walk, and there's a lot of different things they've got to be able to do. And I think you're getting into, you actually have to do some analysis about what those guys actually do, right?
Correct. And that's critical because there's a couple things, and it goes across the spectrum of training individuals and athletes and tactical athletes, is sometimes you only get one opportunity because they don't know who you are. Just like when you're working with an ODA, that ODA has a team sergeant known as a team daddy. And if he has no faith in what you're offering to his team, that team is not going to work out in that weight room. They're not going to listen to what you do there. He's going to take his people and go train them himself. So it's critical in this that there's a relationship. There's a trust that has to be played into this. And it's not like you walk in and go, hey, I'm so-and-so from, Big U, do what I say. They're not going to deal with that. These are professionals. This is how they make their living, and they've been through some really tough times. So they're looking at how can you help us and vice versa. How can I help you? And that's the relationship. When you get into that level of training, you have to develop. No different than we do with a professional team is you are, even though it's a team, there are a lot of individuals. And each individual has a specific need. And a lot of times it's driven by contracts. So sometimes you get their attention, sometimes you don't. And it's a tough thing to learn because we all really care about what we do and how we do it. And when people don't want to do it, you kind of take it personal. And when I was with Cleveland, our all-star catcher, Sandy Alomar, once told me, he says, hey, don't get upset. Just work with the ones that want to work with you. The other ones will come. If they don't come, that's their fault. That's their loss, not yours. And you have to look at that through that lens sometimes, and that keeps you grounded. It keeps you focused in on what you have to do. Because at the end of the day, the body doesn't know whether you're flipping a tire, driving a sled, pushing a Humvee for a leg drive. It's being stimulated. And sometimes you need that. You need to think through these processes and make it into an enjoyable environment versus, hey, we're just going to the weight room to push steel.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think from a credibility standpoint, having a clear understanding of what their requirements are. As a police officer, I can tell you that, or I can attest rather, that you're not working with athletes in most cases. And I'd be curious, just in the realm of, I guess we have to kind of separate a little bit, if we're looking at those job requirements thing, a professional athlete who is going to have that opportunity to do a warm-up, for example, and get stretched and get those little task warm-up routines in, versus the people who are not going to get that, who are going to get, like you said, the wildland crew who is going to suddenly jump on a helicopter and get inserted into a forest somewhere to fight a fire, or that cop that's going to jump out of his car and chase down a guy. And I'm curious what light you can shed on not only just those operational requirements and how they translate into training, but also how people like that are best served to prevent themselves from getting hurt.
I think the reality on the ground is people have to understand and accept that we're getting old. And every day
True story.
you get older.
Yep.
And so in fire in particular, you're dealing in an environment that from the day you start, every day there is something that's harmful to your body and even, potential death. And the amount of cortisol dumps that take place when you hear what we call the tones, when the alarm goes off in the firehouse, the calls on the radios, those in the beginning, your body will react and work off of, but over time, it starts to create a negative effect to your internal organs. So again, you're dealing with a lot of different issues, but the one thing that is consistent, whether it's law enforcement or fire, is everybody wakes up with pain. Because think about all the gear you carry. Think about what they carry. And carrying body armor, a weapon system on your hip or around your waist, that patrol car is jam-packed. You got no mobility. And over time, you start to lose that mobility on top of what you're doing professionally. So by having that in the back of your mind going, I have to constantly work on my mobility, because as I say, mobility is survivability. And we teach that. It doesn't matter whether it's the fire or whether it is in law enforcement. And the other point that people don't understand is, when you work with academies, you watch people move, and people can't move. And part of that is, I'm dating myself, but when I went through school as a youngster, we had physical education throughout, until you were in high school, and then you played sports. But playgrounds, you went out for recess, you were hanging on monkey bars, you were falling off of ladders, you were doing all these things, we took for granted. But we're very mobile. And in today, you watch people run, you watch people jump, climb, and you sit there like, oh, that hurts me. And so we are faced with the reality on the ground that the people that we're entrusted in to train, we almost have to go backwards and start to work with the basics of mobility. Because if not, all we're going to do is increase their potential injury, because we're putting them under a load with lack of flexibility and joint mobility. And that should be the first that we have to look at.
We recently did an episode with a physical therapist, and we talked a little bit about the mobility stuff, and that's exactly the struggle that I deal with every day, waking up, exactly like you said. It's stuff like I can't pick my leg up high enough to get in my car. And just those basics, if I work on just that, go a long way. And the other thing that you hit on was the constant like cortisol and adrenaline dump. And there's a whole other tangent that we could take that maybe we'll save for a follow-up episode if you're up for it, or another day. But just the impact that can have on your wellness and dealing with those ups and downs, which is a whole other topic. But I had to hit the mobility thing, especially because I've noticed that has become a huge emphasis of mine as I enter the second decade or so of my career.
Well, I'll tell you, here's a simple one you can do at home. Lay down on the floor. Okay?
Yep.
You get up 3 times.
It's a favorite of mine.
Now when first you want to have a good stiff drink. You lay down, and when you get up, let's say you use your right arm to get you up. Okay? You stand up, go back down, lay down. Now you can't use your right arm. Now, get up. So what's your tendency? You want to use your left arm. Okay, so now I've used both arms, so I can't use it on my third. So how are you going to get up?
It's a trap.
Okay. Well, you try it, and you're going to find you're going to be doing some movements that you're probably going to laugh at yourself and go, man, I haven't done that since I was a kid. But if you did that every morning, think about how much better your mobility would be just by getting up.
Yeah, I'm going to try it.
Yeah, it's you're going to laugh. I mean, it's funny, but it does work.
Can you talk to us about heat stress injury prevention?
Well, heat's a big issue, especially if you're dealing in a hot environment, and California can get pretty hot, and especially during wildland season. One of the challenges is first and foremost, you have to have a good foundation from a standpoint of understanding hydration, because you have to prevent it first. Because the last thing you want to do is have to deal with it. So by teaching early and doing it often, it allows you to educate them on how to properly hydrate. And so, for example, in our Wildland Academy, every individual, every morning, they do a couple things. We do an omega wave for heart rate variability, which is another topic. But they also do a urine test. So they show up every morning with their little sample of urine, and they have to do a visual check. Okay, so first and foremost, think about the latrines you've seen, and there's a sign above the latrine that says, "Are you hydrated today?" And everybody laughs about it. But how many times have you actually done that? How many times have you practiced it?
I've always been curious how much those
a lot when I'm overseas.
Yeah, I'm always curious how much that actually weighs in. Like if that is accurate.
Well, it is accurate. So here's what happens. They come in. They physically have to look at their urine against a card that has that color chart. That's one. That's step one. Step two is they're going to use a tool called a urine-specific gravity refractor. And it's going to give us a numerical number that's equal to their level of hydration. And then they're going to test it themselves. So they're going to get really good after 21 days of testing their urine to understand what the data says, what that color says, and what their eyes interpreting that color is. And then we also do weigh-ins and weigh-outs. But that's part of our educational triangle, because once they leave the academy, they no longer have the USG. They still can do a scale. They can still do the color. We're good. Now, let's say that crew gets deployed out of county. The scale goes away, but they still can look at their urine. So we've taught them how to be self-reliant and taking care of their hydration, and that's just the educational component. Then we teach them about how to actually hydrate. Okay? The hydration is based upon the 1.5 liter rule. Your body can only absorb 1.5 liters per hour. So in that, we provide them all the water they want, all the water they can carry. They're going to carry an electrolyte solution known as drip drop. They're going to have access to that. And then they're going to have access to another product, which is a carbohydrate drink that they can actually drink it and maintain levels of carbohydrates or energy while they're working. Now, the key is to teach them how to use a little bit of each, keeping in mind that 1.5 liter rule. This way, they're getting all the proper nutrition, or should I say, they're getting the energy from the carbohydrate drink, they're getting the electrolytes, and they're getting the water, and they're maintaining their hydration. That's part of the strategy. The other component, which happens way before they ever get there, is we have a VO2 standard, that work capacity level that they have to meet. In fact, we're in the process of bumping it up even higher this year, going into next year's season. By having a standard requiring them to have a pretty high VO2 max, or the ability to work, that allows us to really slow down the increase of temperature of the body as it starts to work, because we know that the higher your VO2 is, the slower the process where you start to generate heat internally. So that's part of our prevention aspect of that. And then again, understanding the work ratios, we teach them about wet bulb and how that affects the atmospherics affect the crew. We're very protective during an academy, but once the season starts and we talk with our foreman, is as they spin weather to monitor weather patterns or weather behavior, by understanding the physiological stresses placed by the weather on their crew, it gives them an understanding of how much stress is being placed on them besides the terrain, the heat, and now the atmospherics, and he can now understand when to push and then when to pull back. So that in itself is how we tackle our heat illness type injuries.
I have a follow-up question about the VO2 thing, but I do want to hit a little bit more about Drip Drop. It is no secret that Drip Drop is one of our sponsors. We're a big fan. Gyms, flight docs really push Drip Drop when we're out doing, or when they're out doing, I should say, deployments and stuff like that. I hand it out to all my SWAT buddies and cops. I work in Arizona where it's obviously pretty hot. So in the summer, I've had a lot of good results with it. But can you talk a little bit about the physiology of Drip Drop and a quote-unquote oral rehydration solution? What does it do that just drinking water can't?
Well, first and foremost, water doesn't have the electrolytes that the drip does. And so you're replacing, as an oral rehydration solution, the lost electrolytes. And when we talk to people about it, we first tell them, it says, when you work out and you take your shirt off, do you have a heavy white stain? Do you have a light stain? We can actually get into the sciences of how much actual sodium you lose in there. So when we look at a product, for example, as Drip, when we selected it, we were looking at a couple of critical components. One is the amount of electrolytes in the actual mix, how much is in there. The amount of sugar, because again, we wanted a product that did not have a very low sugar content. And then the other one, which is really critical, is the osmolarity. How fast does it get into the system? And those three are the driving force behind the products we chose. And then the fourth factor, really, which sometimes could be the first factor, is taste.
Yeah.
You know, and because there's some products out there that we tested or were extremely well, but in the beginning, boy, they tasted really bad. And if you ever had Pedialyte before it got Pedialyte flavors, it was pretty gnarly. I mean, it was like, ugh. But again, it was designed for infants that didn't have taste buds at that time.
Right.
So one of the key components that fit perfectly when we were looking for a rehydration solution was the fact that we can take it with us and carry it. Each individual can carry it on their kit. We can dispense it. We can get it to somebody quickly, and it was filling all the voids that we had as an organization. And again, we saw and developed protocols that were based upon the testing we did in our wildland program that we're able to push out into our organization in reference to if you're at a certain hydration level. For example, you show up and you're significantly dehydrated, we can tell you exactly how much you need to take. And it has been proven, tried after class after class to get the results. And so part of it, again, we're always looking at the product and how it works within our system, and this product has not let us down.
And you mentioned the sugar content. This was something that I'll admit, the first time I came across Drip Drop and I saw that, it listed sugar as an ingredient, it had calories, and a lot of people who I've interacted with since have seen other products and said, well, I think, this product over here has the electrolytes but doesn't have all the added sugar. And
right.
My understanding in talking with, obviously, the guys at Drip Drop and also with some of my doctor friends, they tried to explain, or they did their best to explain the osmosis component and how the electrolytes follow sugar into your bloodstream. Can you talk
as
a little
a
bit?
delivery mechanism.
Yeah, exactly. So can you give us an overview of the role of sugar in something like this and why it's necessary and what purpose it serves?
In their formula and how they formulated this, and again, this is product has been in the world before it ever hit the markets in the United States. It was used heavily and designed originally for humanitarian aid. And so in their development, they looked at the delivery mechanism, and by having and I without really looking at somebody's notes and saying, how much sugar content did you actually start with and how did you find, and at this point in their studies, I guarantee you that they looked at different levels of how to deliver it into the osmotic process so that the body started to absorb it quickly. Because again, that's their key, is how fast could they get it into the system? Because the body, you're sitting there in a dehydrated state going into some type of heat illness, and you need to get those electrolytes into their system. So by having that in their formula at that dosage or that milligram was critical for them to really finish off that process where it blends and it's getting into the system, and where you look at higher content sugars, or think about, I'm not going to mention products, but there are products in the market when you first taste them, it kind of gives you that gut check, like, ugh, and you react to it. Think of that as a high contents in a delivery. It's not going to mix. It doesn't work real well. It's kind of hard to really get into the nuts and bolts, but they just found that this is the amount of sugar that they needed to basically maximize their delivery process so that it was able to get absorbed quickly.
And you mentioned the 1.5 liter rule in terms of how much water your body can absorb at a time. Can you talk a little bit about protocols for like staying hydrated before you actually have to deploy on an op or a mission or a game or something like that, versus how much you can actually, last minute, slurp down a bunch of water and try to stay into it, like in the middle of whatever event you're doing, whatever that is.
Right. I think the biggest challenge is if you're already thirsty, you're already behind. And like anything else, we talk about it in the department, you have to be fire ready all the time. And what that means is at the end of your shift, you literally have to, if you're coming back the next day, you literally now have to start prepping for the next day, just like you would prep your gear. So our question is, what are you doing to maintain your level of hydration? How does that work? And that's why it's critical in their educational component when they're going through an academy. They're learning that. They're learning how their body operates because they've never been put through this kind of scenario. So we talk about natural, adding additional salt to your meal, fruits and vegetables. Which ones are going to provide you natural rehydration as well as some electrolytes? So we start going through a process. What works for this individual might not work for someone else. So I'll give you a great example. We had a young man years ago. We nicknamed him Mongo. He was a big guy, and he went through wildland, probably weighing about 225.
I work with that guy.
And he came in one day and he says, "Man, I am just tired of drinking." So we're like, "I get it. Everybody is. So let's try fruit. Let's. Here's what I recommend: stop by a grocery store, pick up blah blah blah." So he picks up 2 cartons of strawberries, and Mongo devoured 2 cartons of strawberries. Guess what? Next day, Mongo was well hydrated, ready to go. In that instant, I wouldn't recommend you go buy 2, pallets of strawberries, but he understood how his body used fruit to get him hydrated for the next day. So it's part of that whole process of what is your performance routine? Just like what is your routine prior to starting your shift? You go through your checklist, you go through all the different things, and you get in the aircraft. What does the pilot do? He goes through his checklist. Same concept. What is my checklist to maintain my level of hydration? Because if I start it when I get to the station, I'm already behind the 8 ball. And studies have shown that firefighters generally show up in a somewhat dehydrated state.
This reminds me a lot of that saying, which we've said a bunch on the podcast, and that is, when the time to perform arrives, the time to prepare has passed. And understanding what your body is going to demand, I take the big 64-ounce Hydro Flask to work every single day, and I consume a lot of fluids. Like, I'm constantly drinking water, and it helps keep me in that ready state all the time. But the idea, I think, that I'm hearing from you, Fernando, is that when that day arrives, that you have to go perform whatever task it is that it's too late to figure out at that point, right? Like, you already have to have the hydration situation squared away ahead of time. And I think that's a big takeaway, I think, for this.
Right. And then the other key component, like we talk about in the morning when they check their rigs, depending on whether it's a structure side or a wildland side, there should be a preloaded bottle in that rig, in the ice chest, ready to go. Because we never know when they're going to get toned out. And usually when we do have, especially in the structure side, where we have the perfect storm, when someone goes down with a heat illness, it tends to be the guy's coming off of a double shift. He picked up a paramedic shift the night before. He's showing up. He's already somewhat dehydrated. Hey, we're going to battalion drill. They just had coffee. They go to the battalion drill for 2 hours. They're coming back, going to get some breakfast. Boom, they get toned out. They got a 2-alarm structure. Get up on the roof, start venting. Boom, guy goes down 30 seconds as he starts. So as you start to dirt dive the event, you'll find showed up already behind the 8 ball. So we also, realize that's reality on the ground. So if we have that available and they have a confirmed fire and it's going, they could at least grab and slam down 16 ounces of fluids and get an electrolyte in their system right now. So again, we're also trying to be very proactive on that side. Our wildland guys are really good. They'll come back from PT, get their PT done early in the morning, get ready before lineup, and guess what? They're already putting down 16 ounces and electrolyte.
This is a really good point, because I have found that I do a pretty good job of just generally being hydrated. And there's something to be said about going into it prepared, and something to be said about being proactive in terms of, like, all right, I'm doing a hard workout. I'm probably fine, like, for this, because I can generally get enough.
I need to clarify real quick. Mike is notoriously thirsty. It's like a thing for Mike. If you've ever sat with him, whatever he has in front of him, he's going to drink it. You can screw with him that way. Now you know.
But, I've generally found that you can stay hydrated enough just drinking water and eating whatever that you eat is. But you have to recognize those events that are going to put you a little bit behind the curve. So if I know I've been out on an op, or if I know that I've gone for a run or for a workout, or, something like that, you have to think about staying in the fight for the next thing, right? And so that's part of that rehab routine is, all right, I'm gonna hit a drip drop real quick, because I know I'm behind the curve now, right? I could probably survive this, but
Murphy's an asshole. And the second you get off the last op, you're going out on the next one. Yeah. Like, you don't get to pick when the next one's happening, right? Yeah. One thing I wanted to ask you about is nutritional supplements. And I had no idea until my first time overseas how popular these were. I'm walking around, to Afghanistan, Iraq, wherever, and every dude has this little shaker widget from GNC, and they're shaking up their pre-workout and their creatine and their protein and their ketamine, whatever it is they got. They're shaking it up. They're talking about, like, oh, that's not a fast enough delivery for your pre-workout. You got to keister it. That's how you really get the pre-workout going. And I don't know. I'm an indoor kid. I did not grow up as a gym rat, and so I was a little taken aback by it, especially by the farting. Can you speak to us a little bit about nutritional supplements specifically for working out and building muscle? What's worth doing? What's not worth doing? Is there something we should be avoiding or something we should be seeking out with that?
Well, I think first and foremost, the term supplement should tell you something right there. It is a supplement to something that you should be doing already. And where people totally get away from, and part of it's because of convenience, is are you truly learning how to eat? And, we talk about when you go to the grocery store, what aisle do you go down? Why? Versus the outside. Because all the good stuff's on the outside, not the inside. So it's a process, and we talk that before we even talk about supplements. And it's just really educating people to understand that it starts with that. You're fueling the body. And if you can't fuel it naturally, it's like these guys get hooked on the energy drinks. It's like, why do you need an energy drink at 9:00 in the morning? There's something not right with that picture, because you're relying on an artificial substance just to get you through the day. And same thing. Now, it's one thing if we're trying to put 20 pounds on an individual and you have them in a very structured program and you need to increase his protein intake. Yeah, that's you're trying to specifically have a goal to reach, and the body's going to need an additional amount of protein into his diet in order to achieve the goal that you're trying to do by adding weight and muscle. But generally speaking, a lot of these supplements are specifically a fast way to avoid having the reality of what am I doing properly to feed the beast. Now, are there items out there that support my work as far as some of the essentials and so on, the essential amino acids and stuff like that? By all means, yes. But here's the other question is, how do you know you need it? There are some phenomenal programs. One in particular is a company called Insight Tracker, where they'll do blood work up on you and do a nutritional panel on you and tell you what you are missing, as well as give you the actual list of sources to alleviate those negatives. So you're truly getting an individualized nutritional evaluation with solutions that you can apply without even having to put a supplement in your body. So first and foremost, I think that's the key component, because think about this. If we're talking about training somebody, and it's very relevant to fire, and I tell my guys and my gals, I said, stop and think. An Olympic athlete maybe has 4 Olympics in him or in her, maybe 5 if you're a hurler or do curling. But generally speaking, you have a very limited, finite period of time to compete. When you look at their training schedule, it's 52 weeks, and it's laid out specifically to achieve certain outcomes through that training year. You go to pro sports, you go to collegiate, it's all based on a season. Okay. Now, stop and think. Law enforcement, fire. How do you set up a training program for 30 years? A little different. It's interesting because it's a challenge.
Step 1, survive that long.
Exactly. That the golden parachute's 30 years. But when you put it into reality, it is not as easy as people make it to be, that, hey, we're just going to put this program together. And I always point back to a statement that Dr. Mel Siff said years ago. He says, any fool can train a fool for at least a year. And then that's so true. The key component is, as we start to train you up in the beginning of your career, is we're breaking down some of those myths about the supplements and teaching them that, hey, you have to learn what you're putting in your body and how it affects you long-term, short-term, energy-wise, and things of this nature. So we tend to push away from the supplement talk, because they all show up with, hey, what do you think about this? Should I take this? And we're like, no, let's get back to the reality of, do you know how to cook? Do you know how to go shopping? And simple things that we learn in baseball. You take pro athletes, and trust me, some of them didn't even know how to use a microwave.
You don't need one. If you got a can of dip and like the white monster, you're good.
No cowboy. Yeah, put a dip, a chew in a do.
Called that the Loadmaster Special.
But it's a challenge. I know that you talk about fire. Traditionally, that was one of the reasons why for years the highest statistics of death in fire departments was cardiac events. And you look at the diet, and they're still on the fire stations. You go in there and they have platters. They don't have plates. They have platters. And people would eat off of platters. And so think about how much food you pile on that platter. So that is starting to really, you don't see it as often. You still see the donuts. You still see all the other things.
No.
And it's a challenge because it's all about educating people, going, look at what you're putting in your body and you expect to perform. And I don't like talking fitness with people as far as like in the fire service and stuff, because to me, it's performance. It's all about performance, because what you do for fitness has nothing to do with what you do for a living. Okay. And so by making sure and emphasizing this is about performance. So you're going to put cheap gas in that high performance engine. Why? So we always go back to the basics of, hey, let's put good food in here. Now we have individuals now who become plant-based oriented and have had phenomenal results. So we embrace that because, again, we know that the body can operate in that level. We have vegans in our department. And so these are all the challenges that we see. But again, one, I think probably the missing link in all this is most departments are a one-man band. They only have one subject matter expert, and we lack what the military has when you have all the Thor 3 components supporting a group where you have the nutritionist, you have the psychologist, you have the strength coach, you have the physical therapist, the athletic trainer. At times, you're just literally the one-man band, sitting there at the corner with the cymbals and the drum.
Speaking of that, we've mentioned Thor 3 a couple times. That's a unique training regimen that developed in and around the U.S. Army Special Forces community. Can you speak to what Thor 3 is and what it entails?
The Thor 3 was a component for U.S. Army Special Operations Command, and it was basically part of what they call preservation of the force, and then later became preservation of the force and family. This basically was, and it's funny because in 2008 I actually did a brief at SOCOM in reference to programming a program such as the Thor program. But what was really a huge step in the thought process was they saw their operators in the GWAT time during the global war on terror that they were starting to fray. The constant deployment, the wear and tear on the force was starting to show, and the GWAT had no end in sight at that time. So they started to look at how do we provide a better system for our operators. And every component of the special operations community started their drive into creating their own human performance system. And it's funny because the Navy was way ahead as far as naval special warfare. They had already started implementing programs prior to the start of preservation of the force and family. And you go to the Ranger Regiment, they were already running their own program. So which was called the RAW program, Ranger Athletic Warrior program. So when the Thor 3 came in, it was basically, I came in when it was just starting. We actually opened up the facility and just started. We were in a warehouse, and I mean, literally when we showed up, they hadn't even put in any of the flooring, anything. So we built it from the ground up. But what they did is they took an athletic model or the sports medicine model and basically tried at the beginning just to drop it in and start to build. And to where it's at today, I mean, it has grown leaps and bounds where now even the regular Army is starting to utilize that same methodology for their battalions and so on. So it's really a protection of your investment in the warrior. And I think that's probably it runs the gamut because they've learned. And one thing about preservation of the force, when they added the family, they realized that they had missed out because the family was going through those same stresses by the deployments and then the divorce rate and things of this nature. So as the Thor 3 started to build out, they started to add more components that were very focused on the family side versus the performance side. So it was a huge holistic approach that right now is really bearing fruit. And then the other piece that really has piqued my interest is the program being run at Lackland Air Force Base. And they're you want to call it a preschool, I guess, for their soft pipeline. And they realized that they were losing personnel through that pipeline because they physically, mentally couldn't cut it. So they pretty much built it from the ground up. I think it's an 8-week program, and it's run like an athletic program. They come in, use all the technology and the weight training and the nutrition and the sleep, and they do sleep deprivation. They put them in the tanks. By the time they're done with the prep and they get into the actual pipeline, they have a higher success rate. So again, there's an interesting model that has taken off and has really proven itself in the Air Force's pipeline. So,
Yeah,
in general, that's the POTUS in a nutshell.
yeah. A POTUF, the preservation of force and family. I always get a kick out of, it applies to family too. I like the idea of making all the wives go out and hit the gym for us.
Yep.
And to the credit of several of the organizations that I've worked with, they actually do make a lot of things available to the spouses, which is really, really cool. So we've talked a lot about 10th Special Forces Group, and of the Special Forces groups, they all have kind of a regional flavor. 10th Group is responsible, among other things, for Europe. And because of that, they have an Arctic mission and an Alpine mission, like mountaineering stuff. And that has unique risks and hazards and physical loads. Can you speak to optimizing conditioning for extreme cold weather and high elevation? Because there's a decent chance with the global tensions that we're facing that we may end up back in the Arctic.
Right.
What?
I know.
Well, one of the things that is synonymous with 10th Group is that they do a lot of what's called wet training, winter exposure training. And so the cool thing is they get to go up to ski resorts in the winter and spend a couple of weeks up there skiing and stuff like that.
That sounds horrible.
Yeah, exactly. But the negative side is that over the years, they've had a lot of injuries associated with the skiing.
Yep.
And part of it is they're in phenomenal shape, but they're not in skiing shape. So that was one of the things that goes back to having that conversation with a team sergeant coming in going, hey, my guys are getting ready to go for wet training. Here's the history that we've had, blah, blah, blah. What can we do to get this thing rolling? And I'll tell you that the interesting point goes back to my original point, reference to relationships. I saw a colleague being asked the same thing by another ODA that was going to do wet training also. And because of his, I'm going to say, young, minimal amount of experience as a professional, he immediately said, we're going to go squat, we're going to go do this workout, we're going to do this workout. That ODA never came back. Just totally blew them off because that's not what they needed. They were already there. What they needed to do was try to help them prepare for the winter program. So we talked about skiing. We talked about how we can do things in the weight room. For example, have you ever seen a thing called a Bosu ball?
Yes. That's
the
it's
half
flat
dome
on one side and then a ball on the other.
Yep. Yep. And we would put them on the Bosus, and we would actually, by command, and we would do it specifically after running on a treadmill. We'd come off so they're fatigued. They got to immediately jump on the Bosu, and then we would give them commands of turns and pushes and mogul, and so that we are starting to really focus in on their stability, their fine motor skill set when they're fatigued. And so we made it specific to some of the issues that they were having in the past. We even looked at some inline skating where they could actually mimic cross-country skiing, but that kind of got shot down. So we looked at loads and stuff like that. And so anytime we put them on the mills and we were prepping for either a schools or winter programming, I mean, they would have to basically carry their kit, their rook. And we always had to carry the rubber duck, and then periodically we put something in their hand, or we would rig up a sled to be pulled behind them, just like they would have to during winter training. So
yeah, it's important to emphasize when we talk about skiing stuff. This isn't typically recreational skiing.
Yeah,
sometimes it is, but
yeah. Well,
often,
in the beginning, they actually learn that before they actually go to the next phase.
Yep. But eventually it builds up to skiing with rucksack and body armor and a weapon, radios and ammo and batteries, and that's a different level of skiing, and not on a nice, pristine, manicured slope, but on wherever we drop you, right? So, same question, but for desert work. How do I prepare people conditioning-wise for desert work?
Heat acclimatization is probably the first. They got to start working in the heat. They got to get their body used to working in the heat, just normal PT. And that has to be part of the training program. And to include past your training, beyond training is, let's say, you're an SF group and you're getting ready to go to the desert. I'm going to make sure that the hottest part of the day, I got my guys outside working, doing tasks, whether it's maintaining our equipment, vehicles, or on the range. Everything needs to start being put into the heat, okay? And then they'll do reverse training where you're going to operate at night. Now, that's the challenge, because what's normally going to take place? People tend to use prescription drugs in order to sleep during the daytime where they're going to operate at night. So you cause and effect. You have the ambient issue, which is a reality in the soft community. But you have to be aware of those things when you're preparing someone to go down range and truly understand their environment. 10th group, besides Europe, has sub-Saharan Africa. So we had a lot of crews, in Mali and so on. Same thing. We talked about hydration. What was the strategy for hydration? Working out. What time did they work out? They wouldn't work out in the morning. They'd show up when it was hot in the afternoon and work out. So we started playing around with different time zones and stuff like that.
It's funny working in the heat in Arizona in the summer. I have a close relationship with going out and going for a run in the hottest part of the day, which is fine when I'm in running shorts and like a t-shirt. And then I put on all my gear, and there's nothing that makes that fun or enjoyable. Yeah. And sure, you can get used to it, I guess. I mean, you can get used to it in that you can function. It never is fun. It always sucks. But one thing that I've noticed is I have one of these fancy Garmin watches, and it measures, or it appears to measure. I've never actually paid much attention to it, but it tells me like a heat acclimatization score. And earlier you talked about VO2 max measurements, and you also mentioned heart rate variability, and these are all things that kind of taken us a whole different direction that my little Garmin watch, and I think a lot of the Fitbits and Apple Watches and stuff tend to measure. How much stock do you put into tools like that? Are there things that they're particularly useful for or not useful for, or should we mostly ignore them? What are your thoughts?
A tool, depending on the technology, there are a few items that we use. We use a company called OmegaWave for heart rate variability. It's something that I've been using since early 2000s when I was in baseball. And it's a good platform. It has a couple of new generations. We use that for individual work as well as group information. And what we do is we kind of look at that for recovery purposes, and it helps us monitor where they're at on a daily basis, which kind of gives me an insight to how much we have to push, how much we don't. It also provides me a platform to educate our cadre, especially in academies, of what they're seeing. Because again, we all know that cadres and teams can be very tribal. And they can label somebody real quick. And guess what? Nobody wants to go against the tribal chief when they start labeling people. So everybody ends up on that same sheet of music. So with that knowledge of someone is, let's say, in power, they're not, their power numbers are low. We know that they can execute the ladder. They can execute the task that they're given, but they're not going to be clean executions. Over time, it's going to continue to decline. In the eyes of a non-trained cadre, that can be a negative factor in their eyes of that individual, because they're saying, what's going on here? He did okay, and now all of a sudden he's kind of going downhill. What's going on? And so that's the other piece of the technology, is how do you educate other people who are truly non-users of the technology and educate them to see what I see, but now what they're seeing with their own eyes during actual performance. So that's one piece of how we use that technology. The other one that we use, we'll do sleep monitoring, because again, sleep is a huge recovery component, and it allows us to teach them about sleep patterns, sleep hygiene, and part of their performance routine. What are you doing to recover the next day? What are you doing? Are you staying up beyond a certain time? What's your sleep routine? So for the most part, we pretty much very standard with two technologies that we use. And then periodically, if we want to dirt dive a specific task, and we're going to look at load management and stuff like that, we might use a thing called Zephyr, and we'll wire them up, and we'll capture their data and then break it down after the fact. But that's, again, assist us in learning what we're putting them through. And that's the fun part of this job, is I can go in any direction and come up with a project that will enhance our capabilities or open up dialogue into, why are we doing this? Because the science says this, the data says this, but we're doing this. Why? And most recently, we had a conversation with a couple of chiefs in reference to how we run our academy. And the question I had was, again, these are great conversations with as long as people are open to the conversation, is what is enough? How many repetitions is enough? If your data or your daily data dump that you're getting off your wearables is telling you that their central nervous system is fatigued on a daily basis, are you truly getting what you think you're getting out of those individuals every morning? So instead of doing morning and afternoon repetitions, why not just do mornings when they're fresh? And again, these are conversations that are driven by the sciences, because we're starting to see things that no one's ever looked at. Because the old saying, we've always done it this way.
Right. Is there a sleep monitoring technology specifically that you use or that you like or that you've found reliable?
There are two. Both of them have great products. One is the ring, the Aura ring. We like that. And Josh Hagan, when he was at the University of West Virginia and ran at the Rockefeller Center, they did studies on all the wearables out there, and the Aura and the other one is Fatigue Science were rated 1 and 2. The thing I like about the Fatigue Science that fits really nice for us is it forecasts when you start to lose cognitive function or you hit a certain plateau. So it allows you to push it farther down the road by using napping techniques. So from that standpoint, it's a great tool to teach an individual about sleep and recovery. And at what point does he start to lose his cognitive function, or basically become equal to blood alcohol of legally drunk?
Yeah, my Garmin, for example, does some of the sleep stuff, and of all of the things that, it throws a lot of metrics at me, and I primarily use the Garmin when I go for a run. Like, it's not, I go for a run and I use it to track my pace and to see, things like that. And it's got all kinds of metrics on the side that the app shows me. And the only one that I've really ever looked at that I've put much stock into is I wear it to bed and I see what it says about my sleep.
Mm-hmm.
And for example, if I've had a day of drinking, if we've got a barbecue going or something like that, and the next day it will tell me like, hey, your recovery is delayed because you had poor sleep. And I'm like, that's probably a fact. That's true story. So it's interesting though, like, you know, in terms of like how much stock do I put into anything that this thing tells me, that seems to be one that seems a little bit legit. So, or at least a little bit legit.
All right.
So you've done strength and conditioning coaching, and obviously the physiology and all kinds of physical fitness science stuff for all sorts of athletes at this point. You've worked with, I think, Olympic athletes. You've worked with pro sports players. You've worked with firefighters, special forces dudes. Can you talk about some of the general strength and conditioning lessons? What are some of the myths and misconceptions, and what do you think that everyone can be doing more of? If it's like earlier you mentioned HIIT training and the old days of HIIT training, is that still a thing? Is CrossFit still a thing? Is the program of picking up heavy things and putting them down? Is that, you know, what do you think is the emphasis? What should that be?
Well, I think what's important, depending on who you're training, it's got to be based on a philosophy that works. And understanding what you're trying to achieve. Every so often, a new program comes out, and shortly thereafter, usually within 6 months to a year to 2 years, there's a series of injuries that take place based on that particular, you know, program. I mean, I've worked through the tennis elbow era, the racquetball, the joggers issue. We've gotten into CrossFit, you know, and all the associated things that come with that. And, you know, there's some huge benefits by the fact that they got a huge population to start to exercise. But there's a huge population that did that and also beat up because of it. And again, it's a business. That's a business. And I'm not knocking their business. That's just, it is. But when you look at the philosophy, I think one of the key moments in my professional career was when I was at Stanford, and I had just been assigned to take over the football program. And so the goal then at the time under Coach Dennis Green was we were going to change the mentality of Stanford football. In the past, it was like, hey, it's okay. As long as you participate, we don't care if you win or lose. And that was not good with Denny. So not only did he purge out a lot of people, but he started to build a philosophy. So after 2 years, he left, and I ended up staying there, and Bill Walsh showed up. And the first meeting with the team, Bill says, I don't care if you're in the weight room or not. It's all about football. And I'm like, oh, man, you know, there's 2 years of what we built just went out the window. And over time, it really dawned on me what he meant by that. And it boiled down to, at the end of the day, it's all about performance. He didn't care how strong you are, how many hours you spent in the weight room. If you couldn't perform on the field, then he was going to get somebody else. And it really changed. It was like an aha moment. Because when I was in baseball, people would always ask me, who's your strongest player? I go, I don't know. I really don't care. Because at the end of the day, there's no correlation between the strongest guy and the best baseball player, because it's a very skill-oriented sport. So as long as you kept that in play and how it all factored in, and I remember my last year at Stanford, we had Tommy Vardell, touchdown Tommy, and he wanted to do the senior running back squat test so he could get his name on the wall, and I said no. And he was livid. I go, no, Tommy, I'll write your name on the wall right now. I don't care. Why are you going to jeopardize potential career in the NFL to get your name on a wall? Doesn't make sense. What are you going to gain out of it other than you bang your chest, say my name's on the wall, but I blew my back out? So again, risk to gain and so on. So I think when you look at philosophies, it's a matter of what works. And also, you can't get so locked into a philosophy that you lose sight of what you're trying to do. And I guess really when you look at, for example, you go to a collegiate weight room, and if you go to a Division I weight room that has, let's say, the top 20 in the country, I could take the colors off the wall, no logos, no nothing, show you the pictures. You couldn't tell the difference which weight room is whose, because they all look the same. They're all doing the same thing. Okay? Everybody wants to do Olympic lifting. How do you know the guy can do Olympic lifting? That's a skill. But yet we tend to do what everybody else does. And sometimes you got to go, why are we doing that? And how does it fit to what we're doing? And fast forward, I forget the gentleman's name, but they hired 2 gentlemen at Alabama. And they actually have, for their football team, they do individualized programming versus the old team. I'm going to write the workout on the board. Everybody's doing the same thing. And now they've gone to individualized programming based on the needs of that individual. So we go back and we talk about HIIT. When the Washington Redskins were with Dan Riley, who was their strength coach, they were running the old HIIT philosophy, which was really based off the Nautilus principle way back when. They won Super Bowls. They had the athletes. They kept them on the field. So then you got people over here that had traditional weight room programs, sets and rep schemes, the old periodized program. They won too. Who's better? Boils down to who's got the better athletes. We know that, and which ones are not hurt. But again, it's just based upon how comfortable are you with that program, and are you so locked into it that you're not going to change for the betterment of your people? So, case in point, if my wildland guys are going to do they're a younger group, and so I can do certain type of programs with them that I wouldn't do in the fire station. But we could swing kettlebells in the station, and we could do some deadlift work. Where over here, I'm going to do kettlebells, but I'm also do sandbags, and I'm going to do some other stuff. So we could even do a Tabata type program over here with these younger, but I couldn't do the same with my guys in the fire station. So you have to kind of adapt your philosophy based on the people that you have and so on. And again, 30 years.
Yeah, that's there's a key takeaway in there, I think, related to what the performance is. And you've mentioned a couple of, like, baseball being a very technical, skill-oriented sport, for example. And I've noticed that there's a lot of people who have gotten very, very strong in the gym, and they, their max bench press or whatever is, I don't know, a bajillion pounds, or, and it's like that became the skill, quote unquote, right? Like that became what you are competing in. And it's like, I'm not a bench press guy. Like that is not my sport, right? My sport is catching bad guys. And so there's something philosophically, like you said, that I think is key in this, which is like train for what your job is going to require. And that might be skill-based. And sure, there's like the mobility stuff we talked about in the beginning. But it goes beyond just, exercising as a skill, right? Like exercising as your thing. And by
I don't want to be the number one at exercising. I want to be the number one at
and
winning
by all
the
means,
fight, right?
Be like the best exerciser you want, right? But philosophically, what the performance is that matters is, one, the job tasks, right? So whether it's wildland firefighting, it's carrying like a hose line or tools up a mountain to go cut a line, or it's fighting a bad guy and having that, like, maybe it's jujitsu and running and those things. There could be 1,000 tasks that you have to be proficient in addition to the general mobility stuff that give you the longevity of a 30-year career to make it to the end and still have a healthy lifestyle afterwards, hopefully, and not the quote unquote bad back and bad knees to prove it. I think that's a huge takeaway just in the general wellness philosophy of like fitness. So I just wanted to highlight that.
Yeah, I mean, have you ever heard of Pat McNamara?
Yes.
T-Mac?
Yeah.
You ever watch his workouts?
Yeah, I've watched his workouts, and I love that he always uses resistance bands, like a lot.
I love watching him and his background. He's extremely knowledgeable in the philosophies, and he'll tell you when he was at the unit, they had access to anything they wanted, and then they started building gyms, and he goes, why don't we bring the people to us? Let's start pillaging the experts and let's hear all the different philosophies. So he was well based on the knowledge, and then you see him do things, and it's funny. I laugh, but he's doing exactly the right things.
So I mentioned that I love that he uses a lot of resistance bands, and I did the Thor 3. I came upon a copy of some Thor 3 stuff once upon a time, and I was trying to follow that as best I could for a while. It was hard because a lot of the exercises and stuff you had to try to Google and YouTube, and it was hard to keep track of. But I followed
names
as best I could, and there was a lot of physical therapy-esque movements, a lot of resistance bands, a lot of low weight stuff that was just, stabilizer muscles and stuff. And I've been following a power athlete program that is very similar in that regard. But you talk about Pat McNamara, and he uses a lot of that stuff too, and it's interesting. I also got to give a shout out to his basics dude stuff.
Yeah, I love his basic dude stuff.
Yeah, it's hilarious.
We use a lot of sandbags or duffel bags.
Yeah. We
actually buy duffel bags from a company that makes for the military, and we strip all. We have them. They're just bland. They have no buckles, no nothing, and then we'll fill them with rubberized mulch, and we'll throw them. We drag them. We lift them, and again, you're in that mulch is moving, so you're dynamically always working the stabilizers. You got the grip. You can beat the crap out of it. The one thing you got to try this. I mean, I'm pretty sure you've done a good morning.
Oh yeah.
Or get up in the morning.
Yeah. Maybe not well, but I've done them. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, get a sandbag, put it over your shoulder, and do the get up. Okay. And we used to do that when I was at Carson, and that was simulating that you got shot in the shoulder. Now you get up, and you can't put your weapon down. You got to get yourself up. And so we would think of a lot of different scenarios, but we would use the sandbags a lot in those scenarios.
Yeah.
I think along those lines, like I said, when we talk about training, at the end of the day, it's all about the performance. Can you perform? The one thing is you also can't be so rigid that you're not willing to experiment. And one of the things that we started doing when I was at 10th group, and I still do it, and they think I'm a nut, is we'll take a kettlebell and start doing single arm, double arm swings, but you got to walk. And you give them a distance. And they got to turn around. They can't just keep walking and swinging. They literally got to swing, turn it around, switch hands, and all of a sudden it looks like a circus. and they're going with the swing of the kettlebell.
I picture the music in the background.
Yeah, exactly. But when you explain to them and we were doing this with the concept of CQB, close quarter battle, is you can be strong in certain planes, but we tend not to train in the planes that we're going to be weak. So if I can block you straight ahead, that's a strong point because I'm a great bench guy. But if you catch me at this angle, you're going to collapse me.
Yeah.
Because I've never felt load in that position. So by swinging a kettlebell in odd directions, crossing multiple planes, my body is not only stabilizing, and I'm getting a total body work, but more importantly is my body in those planes is feeling load. So that when I have to feel load in the real world, it's not new. My body's felt it and can react to it. And so you have to sometimes take what you're doing in the weight room and apply it with specific concepts behind it and not be afraid to do that. And they still think I'm crazy for doing it. But I tell people, firemen, you don't know when something collapses on you and your hand goes up to block it, or you're law enforcement and you're taking on a suspect that all of a sudden becomes combative, what, he's going to stand there in front of you and square off properly?
Right.
You
Absolutely.
know? And so
Obviously.
we have to be able to train in those chaotic positions within safe
Right.
methodology.
Right.
Yeah. I like that. Just to kind of summarize, I think this has been an awesome discussion. I just want to emphasize some recurring themes throughout all of Tactical Tangents is figure out what it is you're trying to accomplish, work backwards from that, figure out what risks you're trying to mitigate, and then work backwards from that, and be sober about that. Not the fantasy, I'm going to be Superman, but the, hey, I might be in a structure and the roof might come down on me, or I might get rushed by some guy, maybe not squared off with me, right? And that kind of try to apply some real world back into the gym, which is largely a laboratory environment. I think that's an excellent point. And be willing to experiment and be willing to try out new things. And going back to all of the fitness stuff we've talked about, be on a program, get help when you need it, and get your butt into the gym. And when I think, again, about risk big picture, I think about, I know a couple of guys who've been shot. Mike probably knows a couple more just based on his exposure. But I know a lot of guys who've had life-altering injuries from either working out wrong or not working out enough or working out the same thing over and over and over. And if they had just sought a little help kind of along the way, maybe they could have mitigated that and kept themselves out of trouble. So those are kind of the things I want to point out. And you'll notice there have been some themes between what we've seen here with Fernando and what we've seen in other episodes about things like the kettlebell. It turns out has a lot of value.
Yes.
Huh.
Very much.
High intensity has a lot of
Hey,
value.
you give me a kettlebell, a hex bar, and a sandbag, and some rubber bands, and I'm gonna put the hurt to somebody.
I'm going to ruin your day.
The other thing we didn't touch on, but I think it's just as important, especially with law enforcement. And we would do this with our SF guys because we went out a couple times with them on their stress shoots, and you start seeing that weapon move up and down as you're breathing, trying to control your breathing.
Yep.
And so we said, okay, we could add that into our training. And we had targets set up in the weight room, and we would have them do sprints, and it'd be full kit with a rubber duck. And at the end of the rubber duck, we actually had lasers.
Yep.
So
I've seen it.
Come off the treadmill. They would have to do a task, like might be what we call a half moon, where you got to pick up on one knee, you got to pick up a 20-pound, 30-pound, 40-pound sandbag, put it 4 times on top of a bench, and then get up immediately, go to guns. And then you'd have to hit the laser and focus on your breathing. And then we would repeat that. And if they had a sidearm, then we would transition. So that we were not only getting our conditioning in, but we were also getting some skill work in there at the same time. Because we didn't always have the time because they had other obligations as an ODA. So we would combo train when we could to add that skill set so that that breathing was so important for their survivability and execution. And also, keeping them in the yellow versus getting up into the upper colors, where now the cognitive things start to change and so on. So when you start to train people, should never be afraid to also have that specialty time where you're really working the cognitive stuff, you're working the breathing and the skill sets all together when they're in a fatigue state.
Yeah, and that as a point of summary, I think for me is a big takeaway is that when it comes to the things that are highly skill specific, right, to kind of focus philosophically on those things. And that was one of the things that stood out to me in this. One was going back to some of the stuff in the beginning when we talked about hydration and injury prevention. Common theme on the show: when the time to perform arrives, the time to prepare has passed. But also that the performance that happens out on the field or out on your deployment or out on the op or whatever it is that you do, right? That's something that you have to train specifically for, kind of philosophically, right? That the proof is in pudding, as it were. That it's not just something that happens in the gym. Oh, well, you can deadlift 9,000 pounds and so you're good. No, that's not how it works, right? It's all about, like Fernando mentioned, you can have guys who are doing the same workouts in the gym, but they get out on the field and it's anyone's ball game. So I think that's a key thing.
The interesting thing when I was at 10th group, guys would go and give guy on the bench a bunch of grief and go, dude, you're getting too big. I can't pull you off the X.
Yeah.
And that's reality. That's dose of reality right there. Can't get you off the X. You look good, but I can't get you off the X. We're just going to drop a bunch of grenades in here and ammo, and we'll get to you when we can because we can't get you off the X. The other piece of this whole puzzle is what's your plan for recovery? Because one of the things that I learned early in my career in this business was if you can't recover them, how can you train them? So before you even develop or design your training program, design your recovery program first. Because if you can't recover, then I'm not going to get the gains that I expect to get out of that individual or that group because they're under recovered.
And as we know, it's all about the gains, right?
Right, exactly. I mean, we see it all the time.
Right. Mm-hmm. Got to look good naked, among other things.
Yeah, but it's so important that people don't realize to that extent because they take it for granted. Everything you put in your body, what's your recovery meal, the amount of sleep, if you're using types of modalities, whether it's cold plunge therapy or you're doing in the sauna. I mean, there are techniques and protocols that will elicit specific responses in the body recovery. Well,
Fernando, if there's anything else you want to hit before we finish up, we'd love to hear it. But also, if you'd ever like to come back on and talk specifically about recovery, I think I feel like we've done, and it was kind of on purpose, but it's also come together well, sort of by accident. We've done kind of a series now on the first steps in fitness. We've done some injury prevention and rehab stuff with the physical therapist. We've done, obviously, this episode and sort of a series on physical fitness and training and wellness in general. And I think recovery is probably a whole other thing that we can get into. We talked a little bit about sleep stuff in here. I think that plays in well. But is there anything else that you want to hit on tonight that you think we haven't done a good enough job of so far?
I think the only other area that warrants some conversation, and this is really for the law enforcement and the military side, is what we call visual fitness. And in pro sports, in baseball, you always heard the term, see the ball, hit the ball. Well, first and foremost, how do we know you can see the ball? And how do we know you can track it? And the eyes are attached to muscles, but yet we don't train them.
Yeah.
And there's some simple tools that you can literally put at the end of your weapon and practice, or just practice up against the wall. It takes 5 minutes to really work on strengthening the muscles that support the eyes. Doesn't change your visual acuity, but it strengthens your capabilities of keeping your eyes on target because they will wander.
You want to take that, Jim? Or
I think that's huge. It's a big deal in flying is being cognizant of what you're doing with your eyes and the information you're processing with your eyes. And understanding that your eyes can move a lot faster than your whole head can move. And that is hampered somewhat by night vision goggles, for example. So I thought that was an excellent point. Love it.
Yeah, and it's funny because you can use a thing called a Brock string. It's a 10-foot piece of string with 3 balls on it that slide up and down, and you change different directions, different colors, and you can train somebody up every day with just a simple $2 tool.
That's cool.
Interesting. I'll explore that more. Maybe the follow-up episode we'll have to do with you is on eye training and recovery. Those are both areas I think we can get into.
Perfect.
Anything else, guys, that we need to hit before we finish up here?
No, we really appreciate having you on. I thought this is another awesome episode about fitness and making it part of your way of life. And I thought you are a great resource and absolutely worth listening to. If someone wants to find out more about you, where do they go?
Probably can get a hold of me through LinkedIn. I don't have any social footprint out there. I'm
Like
pretty simple guy when it comes to work and stuff like that. If somebody gets a hold of me through work, that's fine. But you can track me down through LinkedIn.
Very cool.
All right, guys. Well, thanks for listening. This episode is brought to you by Dry Fire Mag. Dry Fire Mag solves the common and annoying problem of having to rack the slide every time you press the trigger in dry fire training. One of the bad habits it took me a long time to break was proper trigger follow through in dry fire. The Dry Fire Mag will help you eliminate that problem almost immediately. Go buy a Dry Fire Mag and double your training reps in just a few minutes a day at dryfiremag.com.
And this episode was absolutely brought to you by Drip Drop Oral Rehydration Solution. Drip Drop was formulated by a doctor for quick absorption of water and electrolytes into the parts of your body that need it. You can find it on dripdrop.com or even on Amazon. And if you're military and law enforcement and you're working where it's hot out, have your supply guy buy it for you. You can get it on bulk, on GSA Advantage, or through the National Stock Number System. It's getting hot. It's staying hot in a lot of the places where we work. Go get you some. I like the watermelon flavor. Now, we want to be your preferred performance-enhancing podcast. And it's important that you subscribe, tell your friends about us. We publish new episodes on the 1st and 15th of every month. If you like the work we do, you can jump on Patreon, give us $1 for each episode. We put that money right back into producing good content for you. That's all I got.
If you want to interact with us, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We are at TacTangents. You can also email info@tacticaltangents.com. And that's all we got. Good talk.